Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts in diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Michelle Silverthorn. And together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you don't have to do it alone. And next pivot point, I believe we're stronger together. We are one. So we're going to meet Michelle. I'm so excited to have Michelle Silverthorn with us. She is a recognized organizational diversity expert and in demand keynote speaker. And the founder and CEO of Inclusion Nation, Michelle works with clients across industries to design inclusive spaces centered on equity, belonging, and authenticity. Some things we talk about on the podcast a lot. A graduate of Princeton University and the University of Michigan Law School, Michelle lives in Chicago with her husband and their two daughters. Learn more about Michelle and her work at michellesilverthorn.com. Welcome, Michelle, to the show.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about your new book, the things that you're seeing in the diversity space. But before we dive into all of that, tell our listeners, how does somebody get into the DEI space? How did
Oh,
you
wow.
find your way into this work?
Well, I can talk about how I did it. I mean, everyone does it differently. I did it because that was what I was intending to do the whole time. So I started at the Illinois Supreme Court after I left law. So I practiced law for about 5 years. And then I moved over to the Illinois Supreme Court. And one of the tenets of the Illinois Supreme Court, one of the principles is creating an inclusive and diverse legal profession. And so, because that was one of their founding principles, because that was one of the CLE options, the work that I did starting as an education associate and then the diversity and education director was really delivering not just, resources and guides and how to actually create equity and inclusion in your legal organization, but also really, here are some courses that you can take. Here are some actions that you can take. Here are some steps that you need. So that actionable instruction and, from everyone from the one person, two person law firms to the 7,000 person law firms, giving people that opportunity to understand here is where you can go next. So that's how I got started. I did a lot of learning. I did a lot of lived experiences. I did a lot of data and research. I met with tons of people and tried to figure out what is my niche. And if anyone's listening and wants to try and figure out how they can enter this DEI space, I always will tell people, what is it that you want to talk about, right? What is it that you want to teach people? Most of all, what is the impact and the change that you want to make? Because if you can answer those three questions, what is your expertise in this? And how are you going to design that expertise, especially this year, where it's been very hard for people who are independent speakers, independent consultants because of COVID, knowing what your niche is and being able to go back to that niche and say, here is more work that I've developed for you, here are more guides and resources that I've developed for you is so incredibly crucial. So that's how
Yeah.
I got started. And I love, 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 love the work I do.
I know. I know. I feel so fortunate because when I was in corporate America, much like yourself, early 2000s, like DEI wasn't, at least I didn't see it as a thing. I didn't know people could do this for a
Yeah.
living. And then we all kind of stumble into it in different ways, much like you did. So I love for our listeners thinking about DEI or really any pivot you're wanting to make in your career. Yeah, what's your message? Like, what do you want to talk about?
Right.
And what impact do you want to create? Those are some really good questions,
And
Michelle.
especially for DEI right now, it's such a popular area. There's so much hiring going on. There's so many people who want to get into the field, figure out what they want to do in the field. And I really want people to bring more assets than they do damage. So
Yes.
genuinely think about what is it that you have to bring to the table that is different and is a different messaging. Do you have the resources? Do you have the clients? If you don't have any of that yet, you can build it. But it starts with what is the messaging that you want to do? Like as Julie says, as you are figuring out this pivot, where is your value add in this work?
Yeah. Well, and so much of organizations need to think about that too. Like, what does this
Mhm.
pivot look like for them? And you and I know in the trenches working with our clients and doing speaking and advising and consulting on this, everyone's kind of struggling with where does this go? And I love how your book, so Michelle's new book, Authentic Diversity, great read. She has the old rules and the new rules.
It's
So tell
very
her.
concise.
Yes, it is very tangible, which I always struggle with how academic we can get in the DEI space. We make it really complex. And it's like,
Mhm.
shouldn't take this much effort to learn this stuff, but it is a complex topic. So I love that you distilled it with those old rules. So walk our listeners through like how you decided to write this book and the framing. I love those rules.
So I started to write this book. I did it a little bit reverse than a lot of people do it. I got a book deal before I actually had a manuscript. So luckily that meant that I had 2 years to really figure out what is it that I wanted the message of this book to be. And so when I started out, I mean, I was looking at different aspects of DEI, but it came back to me that what people want are tools. They want a toolkit. I am not an academic and I'm not a therapist, right? And I tell people that all the time. I can tell you all about studies and I can show you studies, but I don't conduct my own. I don't conduct my own peer reviewed studies. I use a lot of them from a lot of very, very smart people. That's the first thing. I'm also not a therapist. And when I say that, I feel like there is a lot of work that you can do. And goes back to what is your value add as a DEI professional. There is a lot of work that you can do. You can dive into why someone feels this way. What are their goals? What are their ambitions? Where are they going? Where did it come from? That's a lot of the work that coaches do, right? For me, though, what I am is someone who is a strategist. As you have, whatever the reason is, and whatever your reason is for taking the actions that you did, let me tell you what it looks like from a systems level right now. Let me tell you what all those individual actions have created when it comes to our systems. Those are the old rules. And then I'm going to tell you here is what you as an individual can do to change those systems. Here are actions that you can take as you know with your own self and your own actions. And then here are actions that you can take with your organization. Because this book is really written toward leaders. And here is the work I need leaders to do. And so, like I said, you can spend years of your life trying to figure out the whys and the hows. And I think that's so important. But for this particular handbook, it's only 180 pages. I'm going to talk about next steps. What is it that I need you to do next? And that's where the new rules come in.
Well, and it's great how you share the stories, your own personal journey, but also these kind of stories of the characters that go through corporate America and
Mhm.
how the
Yeah.
path is different for the white man versus women, for people of color, of course, many other dimensions of diversity that you
Mhm.
include. And I love that because I feel like that's how we learn through story. When I wrote Lead Like an Ally, much the same thing was the story of the journey through corporate America. And think sometimes for the majority group, especially, it's hard for them to see. Like they just don't see it because they haven't experienced it. They don't have that lived experience in that context. So, really helpful to do that. Thinking about kind of hot topics and knowing, Michelle, you're a thought leader, you're a strategist. I love thinking about DEI that way. What are the things that are keeping corporate America leaders up at night right now with DEI? Like where do you see the momentum going?
For me, and based on, I mean, since George Floyd's murder, which would have been May 2020, right? The end of May 2020, I have done, gosh, I don't know at this point, Julie, hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 phone calls. I've done over 100 presentations and webinars. I've talked to many, 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 many C-suite HR leaders. The fear of doing the wrong thing is pivotal. It's essential. The fear of upsetting the wrong people. And so you see, I repeated the word fear twice, right? The fear of making a change and not having that change matter. And then on the other hand, it's the inertia in not doing anything. If we don't do anything, what exactly is the problem? What is the issue? And I tell them the issue is that you are going to continue to either have a crisis happen and you are not prepared for it, you don't have the resources for it. You're going to have a public relations nightmare because, again, you've promoted an all white male class of whatever your executive C suites are. And you're going to have these really talented, people of color, women, minority groups who just want to succeed and who want to thrive. And they're going to keep leaving. And the mood in your organization, the success of everyone in your organization, the ability of people in the organization to feel included, you're going to lose that. And so those are, from my opinion, what is keeping people up. And then the solutions that I'm going to give them. So if you want it to be the case that people are demanding from you, I want more racial equity in my organization. And you look and you're like, I don't know what to do because I've never ever had to talk about race. I have never had to think about race. It has never even crossed my mind to have to talk about race. Then that's what I need you to get equipped to do. And that's why I say one of my old rules is we don't talk about race anymore. And my new rule is, okay, you're going to be very specific about race and how different people succeed in your organization. But again, if you tell people, if you hear from people, here's my concern, here's my fear, here's what I'm worried about, here's what's keeping me up at night, you got to give them the next step, which is here's what you can do about it. And here are the changes that you can make. And then we talked about this, Julie. Here is how you measure success.
Yes, 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 yes. And that's the perfect setup for my next question I wanted to ask you about because measurement is what I'm seeing a lot of, right?
Mhm.
We want to measure it. And of course, I think sometimes this feels very nebulous, right? Like my clients will say, well, we don't have that data. I'm like, you don't have in your HR system
Yeah,
demographic.
yeah, have it. You don't think you have it, and you haven't prioritized collecting it, but yeah.
Exactly, exactly. That's more of the problem. And of course, you can capture that data still, even if you don't have it in a system. Um, but Michelle, how do you recommend people get started? Because I feel like that's still a very daunting step to set up some sort of scorecard or metrics. And then it also toes the line of affirmative action esque type of context, which we know kind of polarizes people too. So walk us through like how to measure, how to get started, why that matters.
Mhm. And it's interesting that you mentioned affirmative action, how it polarizes people. Part of what I think, and this is what the studies will show you, is that the phrase affirmative action polarizes people. When you actually go into, and the idea that, you're giving someone a head start and they don't deserve it, that's what polarizes people. But you actually explain what we were talking about and you take the time to look beyond a headline and actually look into what it actually involves, then you get discussions and then you get understanding. But we never get to that level because it's always just the headline and it's always just, I don't want quotas because quotas are bad. And then that's the end of the story. So, from my perspective, if you are going to really do this, if you are really going to not have it be nebulous and you really wanted to have some results so that the people in your leadership and your management can say, okay, here's where we are going, you can't just start by saying, okay, I'm going to pull a whole bunch of surveys out. You got to start with what your goal is. Like, what are you trying to do? And if the way to figure out where you want to go is to figure out where you are starting, that's great. So that's why we measure data. But once you measure data, you got to tell me where you're going next. So if the data that you're, I mean, we do all sorts of things here. So if the data you're measuring is you want to do focus groups, or you want to do surveys, or you want to do sentiment, or you want to just look at resumes and promotions and job postings and pay equity, whatever it is, don't start with everything, right? Because you start with everything, you will be completely overwhelmed. Pick one or two departments in your organization. Pick one or two sectors within those departments. Pick one or two demographic groups and figure out if I'm actually going to look at, say, racial equity today, or gender equity today, or queer and LGBTQ plus equity today. What I'm going to start with does not mean you have to end there. It's just a way to start. And so you start with this analysis, you start with this group, you look at your numbers, you say, okay, well, when we looked at this, we saw that there was a 40% difference between Hispanic name sounding resumes that are getting through our first level versus white name sounding resumes are getting through our first level, right? And if you just start there, then you can figure out, well, what is it that we want to get to instead? We would like to have these paths be equal. So how can we get there? What are the actual steps that we can take? And then you sit the people who are in charge of those steps and you sit the people who are in charge of following those steps and you talk them through, this is what we are going to do. And then you say, it would be nice to get to this point. That is our goal. It's not a quota. That is just our goal. And then in 6 months and 12 months, because this is not going to happen overnight, then you say, well, here's what the progress that we made toward it. Here's what we've learned from it. Here's what we lost from it. Here's what we're trying to change. And if it's successful, that's great. You keep going. And if it's not, you change it. And if it is successful, then you go to another group or another department and you do the same thing. So that's my approach. It's tactical, it's step by step, but most importantly, it gets people involved and on board for change.
I love that. Small steps, baby steps. I like that. I have a client that much much opposite to what you said, put together this really robust scorecard. And I mean, it took months, and you can just
Yeah.
imagine like how intense it was. By
Yes.
the end of it, I think they were just not as excited too. They'd lost a lot of momentum in the
Oh,
minutia of
all
it.
of it goes away. I mean, so much of this is momentum. It's so much, I mean, like, a lot of what companies did after George Floyd was like, we're going to do all of these things. We're going to start today. We're going to do it
Yep.
yesterday. And some of them did it, and that's to their credit. And then some of them just quite frankly lost the momentum. The closer we got to the election, the closer we got to the holiday season,
Mhm.
they lost. And like, it's not all of them, right? They're especially their Black employees are like, well, what are you doing? And so if you keep on figuring out that we are going to do everything all at once, you're going to lose everything all at once. So you got to
Yeah.
start somewhere, figure out where you're going, and then see how you can replicate that.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned that in your book too. That one story that sticks out to me that illustrates this, just these subtle, small acts of kindness and inclusion that really make a big difference. I often talk about being an ally, being there for people. the things that you don't think matter that much that really matter a lot to somebody
Mhm.
else that's marginalized. And the example in your book is just somebody asking you if you were okay.
Yeah.
And that's so true of the world that we've experienced this year, COVID to George Floyd to everything in the election. I mean, just so much turmoil. Just knowing someone cares about you in the workplace, and that's so
Mhm.
valuable.
I mean,
So
every
valuable.
every program that I do will start with two rules, respect and empathy. Because if we cannot respect someone else's dignity as a human being, then we're not going to make any progress. Like that
Mhm.
is the bare minimum. You have to acknowledge that I have equal dignity, that my life matters equally to your own, that my success in this organization is equal to your success in this organization. Like that is the bare minimum.
Mm.
Once you recognize that, then the next step is empathy. Then I recognize that you are struggling and I have empathy toward that. You recognize how I am struggling and
Mm.
even if you don't understand it, even if you don't agree with it, like you got to start somewhere. And then you take those two steps, and everyone has to reciprocate them. It doesn't work if it's just one way. And then the next step is what do you do about it? Because the what do you do about it is a lot harder because the reality is, both in this country and in our companies, there are some people who have a lot of power. And specifically, there are racial and gender groups that have a lot of power. And then there are people who do not. So the question is, if you are really going to change systems, which group are you a part of, and what is the power that you have to make those systems change? Because then you
Mhm.
got to go back to respect and empathy. You
Mhm.
start with that, and then you think of, as an individual in this company, in this community, in this school, in this country, what can I do to ensure that those two principles that Michelle Silverthorn started with are actually enacted in my daily life and the work that I do and the systems that I support?
Yeah. Well, and I think for you talk about the people that have most of the power and control, and traditionally that's white males in corporate America. Um, and the word empathy, sometimes when I mention that to them, they're like, intriguing. Like this isn't something that goes in my white male vocabulary very easily. So I'm curious. I think the challenge we have in this work is the very people we need to engage just aren't that engaged.
Mm.
The people with the power, I think sometimes they think that somehow I don't stand to benefit. Back to the fear factor you talked about earlier. I'm going to
Back
say
to
or
the
do the wrong
self-interest
thing.
factor right there, Julie. That's exactly what you said. What's in it for me? I mean,
Yeah.
that's it.
And finding the WIFM for them. I often talk about that. What's in it for me? What's in it for my organization? And all the things that you listed out that you want in your workplace, right? And that means that you need to use your power for others to help them feel those things so you get these great results on the other side. What else do you find? I know the word ally gets thrown around a lot in our work, and I know the limitations traditionally when we talked about allyship. I think we didn't define it as active allyship. There's a lot of performative allyship.
Showing up. For me, I use the word ally a lot, and I used it a lot in my programs post George Floyd, because I want to know what it really means to be an ally and an anti-racist. But for me, the word I use in my book over and over again is leader. Like, if you want to try and figure out what's in it for you, what kind of leader are you? If you're only focused on how is it that I can, be more successful, then you're not a leader. You're a boss, you're a manager, but you're not a leader, because the most important part of being a leader is the people. And that's what I say over and over again when I talk about the new rules. If you are a leader, then you need to have people follow you, not because they have to or because they're getting a paycheck. Have people follow you because they want to. And then think about, what is the legacy that you're leaving behind? So that's the framing and the context I use, especially when I talk to C-suite people. But for me, that's why it has to come back to, what are two things: stories and data. I'm going to share as many stories as I can about what it feels like to be someone who's marginalized, because that's how I want you to get that empathy piece in. But I'm also going to show you the data, because if you don't want to listen to the stories, and everyone does because they love listening to stories, it's human nature to want to hear stories. I'm also going to show you the data because you're also skeptical, because that's how human beings also are. And over again, I do a lot of exercises, a lot of, here's how you can recognize your bias exercises. I do my color blindness exercise I do in my TED talk. But the goal is to get people to understand, this is the reality. Even if you don't want to think it, even if you don't want to accept it, even if it is not your reality, because it's not something you've ever had to encounter, this is the reality for people in their everyday life. So, what are you as a leader going to do about that?
Stories and data. I love that because you get the emotional, the limbic system engaged, and the rational part of the
Mhm.
brain too, the
Yep, and
neocortex. So
they're totally both necessary. You cannot have one without the other. And you got to get both people to be like, okay, I'm going to put aside my critical thinking when I listen to the stories, but I'm also going to re-engage my critical thinking when I say, well, what's your proof? And so
mhm.
I give you both.
Right, and I think sometimes when we use a story, I you know, when I had men read like an ally, they'd say, "Did this stuff really happen to you? Is this real?" You know, somehow like the one story isn't enough, you know, that they challenge it. So having the data to back up, this is a universal experience, and it's also very, I think, there's something about being heard for
Mhm.
those that are marginalized too, that they see yourself in your story. I know the story that you shared about just the promotion track we know about in law firms, you know, that you experienced in your world and how it works for women and for people of color versus the majority group is very different. And we see this in the McKinsey data. Year after year, they report that those promotions are often given to white men first, that broken rung concept. So it's reinforced in the story as well as the data. So tell us, Michelle, like, what is it? I guess give us a window into the world, knowing that stories matter, knowing that all these little subtle microaggressions exist for people that are different in the workplace or have different identities. What is it like to be the other in corporate America right
Yeah.
now? What is that lived experience?
I tell people, so I mean, predominantly the work I do is trainings, right? So you know that I do a lot of workshops and speeches and trainings. And I always say, whenever I'm designing something new, that I am never, ever, 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 ever going to start from the perspective of what would make people comfortable. If I'm walking into a room of all white men, how do I create this program so they can listen to me? I might end there, but that's how I'm going to start. I'm always going to start with, what is the experience that I would like to share with them? What is the experience of those who are marginalized? Because I could have the most successful program, and every majority person in the company can say, "Oh, that was great. I really enjoyed that. That was wonderful." And then you have your Black and Brown people, you have your BIPOC people, you have your transgender people, you have your queer people, and they look at you and you're like, you didn't tell my story. You told a story that would make people feel uncomfortable and bring you back the next time, but you didn't tell the truth. And I always want to tell the truth. So that is the perspective that I'm going to start from. So what does it feel like to be marginalized? It feels like you don't belong. It feels like you're left out. It feels like you're excluded. You feels like you are talented and you know the work and you're doing the work, and it doesn't matter because every single time there's a promotion that comes, it's not you that gets considered. And even if you do get promoted, and even if you do get considered, there is that at word that you mentioned before, affirmative action. Oh, the only reason they got that is because they were Black. The only reason she got that promotion is because she's a woman. Not because of all the talent that you have, not because of all the work that you've done, but you are just limited to this one identity that you have, right? And that identity is central to who you are. But then the whisper is, well, the only reason you got what you did is because of what that identity is. And that is just exhausting. And to wake up that day and to have to put on, I talk about this in the book too, to have to put on that mask and pretend every day that everything's fine and it's easy. And it's so easy to be a Black woman in the workplace, right? It's so easy to be a transgender person in the workplace. It's just so easy. And you have to pretend like it is, because the second that you slip, then you are judged. Then the biases come, the confirmation biases. I know you talk about this a lot, Julie. That's what comes next. And so that exhaustion and that work and that frustration that no matter how hard you work, you will always be judged to be something less than you are. That is what it feels like to be a marginalized minority. And I
Mm,
start there.
yeah.
And then the next step is, so now that you understand that, let's talk about what we're going to do about that. And
Yeah.
what is the change that we want to make?
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you describe that. I mean, at the core of it is a sense of belonging or lack of sense of
Mhm.
belonging and knowing those little subtle everyday things that people say, things that people do are how we are believe whether we belong in an organization or not. So so good. You mentioned Michelle too, like the fatigue factor. I'm curious at this point, 2020 has been a heck of a year.
It's been fun, Julie. I'm not sad to see the back of it, I have to tell you.
I had a baby, that was a big surprise for me. I I got to still publish my book and I still got to speak, so I know for me, I'm very thankful because that's not been I recognize the amount of privilege that I have and the things that I've gotten to do this year, but as we're thinking about 2021, I think there's this heavy exhaustion, this fatigue in the DEI space that I really worry about, that people will stop doing this work because it's hard. It's a journey. It's not a destination. You have to just keep doing it. Those metrics don't move quickly, like
No,
you
they don't.
said.
They move very slowly. Yes.
And we like instant gratification in corporate America. So I'm worried about this. What do you think we need to do to combat the fatigue factor?
I think what we need to realize is that we've spent a year telling people, okay, what you need to do is listen and to learn. And like, okay, that's great that we've listened and learned, but what are you going to do next? Like, what is the change that you're going to put into place? Because you've listened and you've learned, and that's great. And I appreciate that you've done so much listening and learning, but you got to do the work next. You have to actually say, here is a system of this is how we get applicants from the top 7 schools that we only look at when it comes to recruiting. Or when it comes to lateral hiring our managers, we expect our managers to bring in their peers to give us recommendations, right? Those are all things that we typically, a lot of corporate Americans does. So what are we going to change about this? And then once we change that, are we willing to not, when it's not working, when it takes you an extra 6 months to find a hire because you can't just immediately go to your same group of peers that you always go to, are you going to say, oh, I'm exhausted? Because I'm going to tell you something. It has been hundreds of years of inequality. It has been hundreds of years of inequity. If you're telling me you're exhausted after 6 months, I gotta say, well, then you're not ready to do the work, because this work isn't going to fix itself in 6 months. It's not going to fix itself in 12 months. It's going to take a lifetime. But every single day, what I want you to do is to not look at how did you change things. I would like to look at how you progressed things, how you made that progress happen step by step by step. What are the different, some of the things I talk about is habit formation. What are the new habits that we formed? What are the new habits for equity and inclusion that we were able to put into place? How did we get people to adopt those new habits? What are the behaviors that we are seeing that is different, right? So that's what I want people to look at. Because if you think that, gosh, we really would like to get a lot more Latinx executives into the C-suite, you know, and we still have zero, and it's been 2 years. I'm like, well, you've had zero positions open up in your C-suite, so clearly you're not going to get any. Or if you're saying we would like more women managers, and it's been 3 months and we still haven't gotten any, then I would like to tell you, then what are the steps that you are making to get there? Because if your argument was, well, we just put this post out and no one applied, you're probably not going to get there. So it's really a matter of, where are you starting from? What are the steps that you are taking? And then where would you like to be? And then look in 6 months and 12 months and 18 months and say, how much closer are you to where you want to go? And if you've been going backwards, then stop. And if you are going forwards, then keep going. That's what I'm asking
Yeah.
folks to do.
It's good. Yeah, it reminds me of being intentional and being consistent. And
Hmm.
those things are really important for DEIs. You got to keep showing up I like progress versus change
Yeah.
too. That's a good way to look at it. Oh, Michelle, I could talk to you forever. And I highly recommend the book. It's a blend, like she said, of storytelling and data and her own, Michelle's lived experiences, and many of those that are marginalized in corporate America. It's a wonderful window into the world of how you can be more inclusive as an organization with some great tangible rules and steps to follow, much like you've outlined for us today. So it's been such a joy to have you. Tell our listeners, how can they stay in touch with you? How can they follow
Thank
your
you for
work?
having me. They can always find me on any social media platform, and at In With Michelle. I'm typically more on Instagram and Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook, and you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. And then if you want to go to michellesilverthorn.com, and you can find me there too.
We will link to that in the show notes as well. Well, thank you, Michelle. It's such an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening, everyone, and take care of yourselves. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear the message? Hit the share button and connect with us on LinkedIn. You can search for Michelle and I there. We post daily. And you can find us and share this episode anywhere you get podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.